This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On October the 17th, our virtual Defence and Security Studies series hosted former Canadian diplomat and Northeast Asia specialist James Trottier, who discusses the shifting power dynamic among the regional powers most intimately involved in the Korean Peninsula.
So good evening and welcome to the first RCMI Defense and Security Studies expert speaker event for the fall of 2023. Yes, I'm afraid to say it is fall 2023. As I'm sure most of you know, I'm Dr. Daniel Eustace. I'm the director of the RCMI Defense and Security Studies program, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Mr. James Trottier. So the title for tonight's presentation is North Korea's Missile and Nuclear Buildup, Alliance Building, and the Challenge to International Order and Security. And there was a description of that in the flyer that you received. I won't repeat it tonight. But what I am happy to repeat for the third time is James Trottier's distinguished short version biography, which in itself is not that short. But we are very happy to have him here. This is the third time, as I said, that he has deemed to talk with us. He's actually had to put off another event that he was scheduled to do tonight. But let me, without further ado, give you the summary of his long and distinguished career for Canada. So James is a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He's a lawyer and a former career Canadian diplomat with extensive experience in Asia and elsewhere. He headed the political economic programs at the Canadian embassies in South Korea, Thailand, where I understand he goes frequently every year, which is a good place to go, and the Philippines. And he was also accredited to Myanmar, and he's spoken to us previously on issues emanating from Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, and North Korea, where he led a diplomatic mission in 2020, 15, and 16, while concurrently leading political economic affairs at the Canadian Embassy in Seoul, where he also served as diplomatic liaison to UN and US forces in South Korea. So you can see the extent of his experience in that region. He also served for 4 years as at the permanent mission of Canada to the UN in New York, including during Canada's term on the UN Security Council. Yes, I guess we did have a term on the UN Security Council. We won't go there right at the moment. When he served as the permanent mission's acting legal advisor, a significant post to be sure. At headquarters, he was responsible for Canada's political relations with the European Union. Since leaving the Foreign Service, he has continued to write extensively on North Korean issues. He sends me things frequently, things that he has written, and they're always quite informative and useful to me. And he's considered to be one of Canada's, and I would argue, Canada's foremost experts on North Korea. We're happy to have him here because he's regularly invited to participate in expert panels at international conferences on North Korea. In fact, he's missing one tonight for our benefit, and is consulted by think tanks, governments, embassies, and the electronic and print media, where he is a regular commentator, including in the Globe and Mail, the Ottawa Citizen, CTV, CBC, CBC Radio, Sirius, and other outlets. James graduated from Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto and holds an MA in Modern History, also from the University of Toronto. James, it's great to have you with us again. This is the third time, as I mentioned. It's important for us to keep our eye on what is happening in North Korea and the international security challenges that it presents. We are inundated at the moment, as we discussed prior to going online, with what's coming out of Ukraine, with what's coming out of now Israel and Gaza. And yet there's so many other important issues that the international community is facing, and obviously North Korea represents one of those challenges. So we are very fortunate to have you here, and we look forward to gaining more of your expertise and insights. And so, James, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dan, and to RCMI RCMI for the invitation to speak with you this evening. As Dan mentioned, this is my third presentation to RCMI on North Korea, and I look forward to the discussions this evening. Last month, in September 2023, in a blaze of media coverage, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un traveled to Russia by train to meet with Vladimir Putin. This trip has significance for regional and global security. This train trip by Kim also marks the end of an arc that began with another train trip taking him to the Hanoi summit with Donald Trump in February 2019. And in the period between the two train trips, much has happened on the Korean Peninsula and elsewhere. These developments were or are against the background of shifting geopolitical tectonic plates in Asia and beyond, including the chip war between China and the US, the threat of war in the Taiwan Strait, and the hot war in Ukraine. There is a pressing need to reconsider North Korea and Korean Peninsula security in the context of East Asian and global security issues. So I want to start with some comments about an August 23rd trilateral summit and statement of principles and joint statement on trilateral cooperation between the USA, Japan, and South Korea. Another part of this backdrop is the connection between the Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula. In the interest of time, I will not address the Taiwan issue, but I'm happy to do so in Q's and A's if there's interest. Following that, I will speak about the Korean Peninsula developments, including those two train trips I mentioned, and whether China, Russia, and North Korea form their own bloc, and a look at what may be coming next. So as I say, the month before Kim set off on his last train trip to see Putin, another event of arguably more significance occurred with only a fraction of the attention outside of East Asia foreign policy circles. US President Joe Biden, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida met at a summit at Camp David in August 2023 and agreed on a statement of principles and a joint statement on trilateral cooperation to address the threats from potential adversaries like China and North Korea. As you know, the US has long-standing and very strong bilateral relations with South Korea and Japan, its key allies in the region. But for decades, the USA has been bedeviled by the strained relationship between South Korea and Japan, rooted in history. This estrangement has undermined attempts to strengthen regional security. President Yoon has made a concerted effort to improve the relationship with Japan, and this effort has been assisted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Chinese threats to Taiwan, and North Korea's continued missile launches. This has significantly modified the threat perception of both South Korea and Japan. So this provided President Biden with the opportunity to bring the two other leaders together at Camp David. This is the first ever standalone summit between the leaders of these three countries. And they were brought together in an effort to establish a closer and enduring trilateral alignment, locking in engagement at a variety of levels: leaders, foreign ministers, defense ministers, national security advisors, and other cabinet members. This locking in was an attempt to institutionalize the process and protect it from a future isolationist Trump or Trump-like administration reneging on U.S. commitments to its allies. The Statement of Principles and Joint Statement on Trilateral Cooperation provides for cooperation in an unprecedented wide range of spheres. This includes plans to build a long-term calendar of annual trilateral military exercises, contingency planning, missile defense, economic security, supply chain security, emerging technologies, protection of critical technologies, development assistance, and countering disinformation. There is even a provision for creation of a framework for security assistance to Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands. The Statement of Principles and Joint Statement on Trilateral Cooperation includes a formal commitment to consult and coordinate their response on regional challenges, provocations, and threats affecting their countries. This commitment to consult between these countries is unprecedented, and understanding that the three nations will treat any threat to one of them as a threat to all of them, requiring mutual discussion about how to respond. This pledge reinforces the expectation that the three would act in tandem. The pledge to consult has been compared to Article 4 of the NATO Treaty, which allows any member state to raise security issues of concern. However, this is not a treaty, nor an Asian NATO. It's a political declaration. Indeed, U.S. officials have pushed back on any NATO comparison, denying that they are trying to replicate NATO for Asia. This hasn't stopped China from using the NATO comparison and claiming that this trilateral alliance was aimed at containing China. Chinese Communist Party media described the accord as aiming at forming a mini NATO structure that will be destructive to regional security, unquote. So this trilateral arrangement is part of the security architecture that the Biden administration has put in place or strengthened in Asia. The creation of AUKUS with Australia and Britain, the bolstering of the Quad with Australia, Japan, and India, the Washington Declaration between U.S. and South Korea, providing for military coordination and consultation, the increased American military presence in the Philippines, and trilateral military drills by U.S., Japan, and South Korea. So it's against the background of the Trilateral Cooperation Agreement, and also, as I said, the connection between the Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula, which I'm happy to deal with in questions, that Kim made his train trip to meet with Putin. This trip was both symbolic and significant, not least for highlighting the connection between the war in Ukraine and the security situation on the Korean Peninsula, and more generally in East Asia. The Putin-Kim meeting and the discussion about North Korea supplying artillery shells to Russia for the war in Ukraine, shells that are being delivered right now, brought home in a very visible way the linkages between two areas of tension. Highlighting the value that each side placed on the visit is Putin's agreement to make a return visit to Pyongyang. Apart from a common enemy, namely the USA and its allies, both Russia and North Korea are isolated and both are heavily sanctioned. Putin's Russia now has replaced North Korea as the most sanctioned country in the world. This visit offered opportunities for both to circumvent sanctions. In their public remarks, Putin spoke of the strengthening of friendship and cooperation between their countries, and Kim spoke of further strengthening strategic and tactical cooperation. He also described Russia's war in Ukraine as just, and that's consistent with North Korea's vote at the UN General Assembly, where it was one of only 5 countries to vote for Russia on a resolution condemning the war. Most importantly, each has something of value that the other wants. For Kim in particular, this is most unusual. Few people have said in the past that they want more North Korea. So what does Kim want? He wants assistance with the North Korean satellite program, technological assistance with North Korea's missile program, ballistic missile-armed submarines and anti-missile defense systems. He wants recent versions of Russia's Sukhoi fighter jets and its air defense systems. He wants spare parts for its Soviet-era aircraft, both civilian and military. The Kremlin also said they had talked of launching a North Korean astronaut into space. North Korea also needs food, fuel, energy, and cash. Cash may be provided in exchange for more North Korean workers sent to labor in Russia, as well as for artillery shells and munitions for the Ukraine battlefield. Russia may also have been asked to provide humanitarian aid. So what does Putin want? Most importantly, artillery shells and battlefield military equipment, all of which North Korea appears to have in abundance. An expert estimated that North Korea may have tens of millions of shells for artillery in stock. North Korea also has significant armament production facilities. It's not surprising that North Korea munitions are already flowing to Russia. AP reported on October the 8th that recent satellite photos show a sharp increase in rail traffic along the North Korea-Russia border, indicating the North is supplying munitions to Russia. The freight rail car traffic is described as dramatic and unprecedented. Russia also needs anti-tank weapons. So neither side will be announcing the specifics of any agreement publicly. Buying weapons from North Korea, providing help for its weapons programs, are violations of the UN Security Council resolutions that Russia itself voted for. What they actually agreed upon and how far they will go is open to speculation. Some of Putin's comments are meant to annoy and raise questions in the West. Putin's musings may also be a warning to South Korea, which to date is not supplying weapons directly to the Ukraine, but it's supplying weapons to the Americans, who in turn are freeing up U.S. artillery shells for Ukraine. There may be an implied threat of transfers of military technology to the north if South Korea was to supply Ukraine directly with artillery shells. Whatever they decide, much will remain secret. Even Putin spoke of unspecified restrictions on cooperation, and that is part of the good news. And the rest is that because, despite the warming ties between Russia and North Korea, there is doubt among experts that Putin would go so far as to provide North Korea with technology to perfect its ICBMs or build nuclear-powered submarines. As one expert said, even a desperate war machine does not trade its military crown jewels for old, dumb munitions. This would also probably be a red line for China. Experts believe that China would probably pressure Russia not to provide this type of assistance to North Korea, which would increase instability on the peninsula. Also, there is the fact that North Korea has sought to build on its ties with China, its main ally and economic lifeline. North Korea's economy is dependent on trade with China, so North Korea has to ensure that their dealings with Russia do not interfere with their relations with China. This meeting between Putin and Kim certainly gives the relationship heightened visibility and kicks it up to a new level. The meeting also highlighted to the world that Russia simultaneously wages war in Europe and shares a border with North Korea. But does this mean we are seeing the emergence of a trilateral pact of North Korea, Russia, and China? This would have advantages for North Korea, to be sure, and probably Russia. However, China is much less isolated than the other two. This week, President Xi is hosting 140 countries to mark the anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. Incidentally, Vladimir Putin is at that meeting. China also has a much more powerful and advanced economy than the other two. He will be wary of being grouped with the other two in an axis of the sanction. The trilateral cooperation mechanism between Japan, South Korea, and US is very systematic and is based not just on shared adversaries, but shared values and principles and views on international security. It institutionalizes annual meetings, consultation, and cooperation from the leaders on down, and covers a wide range of issues. By contrast, while there are tactical and strategic aspects to the bonds being forged between North Korea and Russia, as well as interests binding each of these with China, the relationship between these three countries is more a loose grouping than an alliance per se. It is made up of states that have a common adversary, namely the US and its allies, and bilateral ties with each other, rather than a trilateral relationship per se. The North Korea, Russia, China grouping is not centrally coordinated, and they have not created the institutional foundation that has been created in the trilateral coordination group. Both China and North Korea feel, together with Russia to a lesser extent, feel threatened by the new trilateral cooperation mechanism between the US, Japan, and South Korea. But each has divergent issues, and each of them is in a different relationship with the US and its allies, ranging from the Cold War standoff in the Korean Peninsula to the chip war and naval and air skirmishes with China to a hot war in Ukraine. They also share the experience of sanctions, but the sanctions themselves vary from UN Security Council sanctions to sanctions of individual states. Moreover, China will be concerned about the rapprochement between Russia and North Korea. China is not fully supportive of the Russian war effort in Ukraine. They have supplied dual-use technology, but they are not supplying munitions directly to Russia like North Korea is. And as one expert said, trust is so low among Russia, North Korea, and China that a real alliance of the three isn't credible or sustainable. North Korea has a history of playing Russia off against China and getting benefits from both. A North Korea that is more dependent on Russia may be less dependent on China. Also, China is going to be more reluctant than Russia or North Korea to associate themselves with this axis of the sanctioned. It may be that this particular grouping is less than the sum of its parts, the opposite of the trilateral cooperation mechanism between USA, Japan, and South Korea. The North Korea, China, Russia grouping may be as much in the eye of the beholder as it is in the thoughts of the participants. This trip to Russia marks the end of an arc that started with another train trip with Kim rolling down the tracks to meet with Donald Trump in Hanoi in February 2019. In 2019, both Kim and Trump set off to Hanoi with high and false expectations based on false premises and on a fundamental misreading of the other side's position. As always, Trump heard what he wanted to hear from his advisors, regardless of what they actually said. He also saw North Korea in purely transactional terms, the same way that he saw everything else in his world. He came in with the notion that Kim would be prepared to denuclearize in return for easing of sanctions and economic assistance. This was based on a false premise, but a premise that has underpinned U.S. policy for decades, that North Korea can be persuaded or coerced into denuclearizing. That is a dead end. While nuclear weapons may have been a bargaining chip that could be bartered away in the 1990s, this is not the case under Kim Jong-un. The nuclear weapon and missile programs are crown jewels of North Korea. They are virtually the only achievements the regime can show its people. During one of my own visits to North Korea, I saw how a missile has pride of place in the Science Museum and how the scientists that developed these missiles have among the best apartments in Pyongyang. In 2022, Kim Jong-un declared his country to be an irreversible nuclear state, and in this instance, he should be taken at his word. That status is now incorporated in the North Korean constitution. The virtual consensus among experts and watchers of North Korea, including former senior officials in the U.S. State Department, Pentagon, and intelligence communities, is that North Korea will never denuclearize, any more than India or Pakistan would. On the contrary, they want to be recognized as a nuclear state, but that won't happen either. Kim Jong-un also came to Hanoi with false expectations, which he later blamed on his advisors. He was under the impression that in return for the closure of one nuclear site, the U.S. would agree to the significant easing of sanctions. And indeed, he may have been able to reach a deal with Trump favorable to North Korea if it had only been him and Trump in the room. But instead, he met in a room, Trump accompanied by John Bolton, who was and is the loudest proponent of North Korean denuclearization. In the end, the Hanoi summit was a debacle. The USA pulled out early from the summit, not even waiting for the official lunch. And that was the end of the Trump-Kim negotiation process. They had one more meeting at the DMZ in 2020, but that was even more of a photo op than the previous two meetings proved to be. For the incoming Biden administration in 2021, North Korea was not a top-tier priority, ranking well below foreign policy considerations such as China, Russia, and other areas, Taiwan, climate change, Iran. In the beginning of the administration, they undertook a North Korean policy review. The result of the review is what the Biden administration described as a calibrated approach. which in turn meant, as in their words, a calibrated approach was a practical approach that is open to and will explore diplomacy with North Korea with the aim of making practical progress that increases the security of the US and its allies. But in actual terms, this meant that the US wanted to talk to North Korea about denuclearization and get a North Korean commitment to denuclearize, the very subject that North Korea would neither discuss nor agree to. So there was an impasse and no negotiations. So what was Kim's response? It was essentially, let the missiles fly. Ever since the collapse of the talks with Donald Trump, followed by the unwillingness of the Biden administration to negotiate, unless Kim agreed to commit to denuclearization, Kim has written off negotiations with the US for the time being and is focused on enhancing and perfecting his missile arsenal with a record number of missile launches in the last 18 months, including at least 2 missiles launched during Kim's visit to Russia. In September 2021, Kim started a new round of missile testing. North Korea subsequently completed several tests, including the firing of multiple intermediate range and intercontinental ballistic missiles. In 2022, North Korea launched a record number of missiles, at least 100 ballistic and other missiles, unprecedented in numbers, quality, and variety. In 2022, North Korea also announced an end to its self-imposed ICBM test moratorium. North Korean missile tests and other actions became increasingly provocative in 2022. On February 18th, 2023, North Korea launched an ICBM, which landed in the water off the Japanese island of Hokkaido, part of Japan's exclusive economic zone. Previously, North Korea has fired at least 3 ICBMs in 2022 and 1 in 2017, the year it also conducted its last nuclear test. Bear in mind that experts doubt that North Korea yet has the capacity to hit the US mainland, despite its claims. They doubt that North Korea has acquired technology to shield warheads in the high temperature, high stress environment of atmospheric reentry. Hence the assistance they would like to get from Russia. So why does North Korea do it? That is, launch these missiles. There are 4 main reasons for the North Korean missile launches. 1, these weapons have to be tested and perfected. 2, to demonstrate to the USA, South Korea, and the international community North Korea's missile capacity and capability. 3, to persuade the international community that North Korea will never give up its missile and nuclear programs. These 3 reasons, in turn, will strengthen the North Korean hand in any future negotiations. But there is a 4th reason for the flurry of North Korean missile launches. Given the poor relations the US has with both China and Russia, Kim Jong-un views the present as a strategic opportunity and is convinced that he can make advances in his missile and nuclear program with little fear of consequences because China and Russia will not agree to additional UN Security Council sanctions or even robustly enforce existing sanctions. In this assessment, he's right. So the US and South Korea have responded to the North Korean missile tests and provocations in a variety of ways, none of which involve attempting to engage with North Korea diplomatically. First, the USA and South Korea responded in kind, deploying jets and military assets. They have enhanced their military exercises. They've issued not so veiled threats to North Korea in response to North Korean threats. Second, in a summit meeting at the White House in April 2022 between South Korean President Yoon and President Biden, the 2 leaders agreed on the Washington Declaration, which was designed to accomplish 2 main objectives, namely 1, addressing growing popular support in South Korea for its own nuclear weapons, and 2, addressing South Korean concerns about the long-term US commitment to East Asia, and in particular to South Korean security. This is to address the concern about isolationist tendencies of a future Trump or Trump-like administration. The U.S. strengthened extended deterrence in exchange for Yoon's commitment not to pursue nuclear weapons for South Korea. The parties agreed to establish a nuclear consultative group to coordinate military responses to North Korea, including the deployment of nuclear weapons and nuclear ballistic missile submarines, and that the U.S. would make every effort to consult prior to the use of nuclear weapons against North Korea. Plus, there is the trilateral cooperation mechanism that I mentioned previously. Key to all these measures is the change in foreign policy under the Yoon administration in South Korea. In President Yoon, Kim Jong-un has met an adversary willing to match the North Korean leader in rhetoric and displays of military might. The Yoon administration has significantly changed South Korean foreign policy orientation. There are 4 policy pillars of its foreign policy. First, the Yoon administration foreign policy goals go beyond securing South Korea from North Korean aggression. The administration speaks about securing the security and prosperity of other regions, including Indo-Pacific and beyond. 2, the Yoon administration has set out liberal democracy as its principal philosophy and guideline for foreign policy. For the Yoon administration, this means working with like-minded partners like Japan and, of course, the US. But this also puts them at odds with countries in the region and beyond, which are not liberal democracies. 3, the Yoon administration said it would unite with like-minded countries against any malicious attempt to undermine the rules-based international order by states which want to break the rules, Russia, ignore the rules, North Korea, or change the rules, China. And 4, underlying these changes in Korean foreign policy is the premise that South Korea's global standing has been upgraded significantly. The Yoon administration dislikes the notion of South Korea as a middle power. Instead, the Yoon government is promoting the idea of South Korea as a global pivotal state, playing a proactive and pivotal role in the international community. So what next for the Korean Peninsula? First, there is familiarity in that we are in the latest provocation cycle from North Korea, from which North Korea has always managed to emerge stronger militarily with enhanced missile and nuclear capability. Second, there are differences this time with the shifting geopolitical situation, the cold, cool, and hot conflicts in various places, and the complicated reality of bloc formations. 3, all of these factors add a high degree of risk. For 70 years, the likelihood of inadvertent conflict and unintended escalation in the Korean Peninsula has been higher than the risk of a deliberate attack. Both risks have increased due to the possibility that the Korean Peninsula could be drawn into conflict due to developments elsewhere. Fourth, despite the risks that I've outlined above, the likeliest end to the provocation cycle is negotiations, not conflict. Fifth, avoiding an impasse in future negotiations will require concessions from both sides. For example, North Korea agreeing to freeze future growth of its nuclear stockpile and missiles, and possibly eliminating some warheads and missiles, an end to uranium enrichment, plutonium production, plus conventional arms reduction talks and confidence building methods. On the US side, it will require easing and elimination of sanctions without North Korean commitment to denuclearization. This is not an ideal solution, but it is viable and would reduce tension. Thank you.
Not much to take in there. No, unbelievable. The depth of information and knowledge you have is incredible. But we're not at that stage of thanking you quite yet, because we still want to extract more from your background and experience in our Q&A session. So folks, if you do have questions, please, the old saying goes, there are no dumb questions. Either raise your hand or type them into the Q&A, and I'll get things going, because there's just a whole lot to think about here. James, I know most folks that are going to be on this call are going to be familiar with this concept of the chip war, but could you just talk a little bit about that? And I think that somehow ties into Taiwan's role in being the leading developer of chips, computer chips. Is that one of the linkages into the potential North Korea-Taiwan issue that you were alluding to a couple of times?
Well, the connection that between Taiwan and the other countries do exist in the chip realm. Yes, Taiwan is has a stranglehold on the production of the chip industry, of the highest quality chips. And the chip war that I was referring to were restrictions put by the United States on American chip companies and American tech companies doing business in Taiwan, and restrictions put on the type of equipment and other items that could be sent to China, which China sees as kind of handicapping their chip production facilities of their own. So that's both South Korea and Japan are involved in this too, because they have chip trade with China. So they're kind of collateral. They risk being collateral damage in this process. So it does involve all of them. The Taiwan connection that I was referring to specifically was more about that there's a tendency in military circles in the past to see each situation existing in its own sphere as distinct potential battlegrounds. And that was reflected in the Biden administration. As I say, Taiwan and China were kind of top tier concerns, and North Korea wasn't. And until recently, discussions about stability and security on the Korean Peninsula touched lightly, if at all, on Taiwan and vice versa. But more recently, ramifications for the Korean Peninsula of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait has moved towards the center of discussion of policymakers and policy influencers. And in fact, Taiwan and Korean Peninsula are connected, and military planners have to plan accordingly. I think that one of the great unknowns is the intentions of countries in the region and beyond are unclear in the event of a conflict in one or both of these theaters. And the intentions are also subject to change in the heat of conflict. If I might, I just might give you an example. In talking on a panel, one expert said the following, and I think this encapsulates the uncertainty of the situation. He said, in the event of an attack on Taiwan, China might want a second front on the Korean Peninsula to tie down U.S. troops in bases in South Korea and Japan, which would otherwise be deployed to the Taiwan front. This might be particularly so if the Chinese invasion of Taiwan is running into difficulty. But in the same breath, or in the next breath, the same expert said, or China might not want a second front in South Korea because it could divert Chinese military from Taiwan to that front. And then in the third breath, he said, well, China might not want North Korean action on the Korean Peninsula in the event of a Taiwan action, but that might not matter because the North Koreans will do what they consider to be in their best interest, and then China would have to decide whether to intervene. So that's just, yeah, I think that kind of summarizes in a way the kind of the uncertainty. It's one of what Donald Rumsfeld called the unknown unknown.
Yeah, the complexity of that range of potential outcomes and effects is just unbelievable. But we've had one question, which I think is sitting at the back of many people's minds, and you've mentioned this, and it really bears directly on what you just said, and that is what you might call the Trump effect. We're sitting here unbelievably, I guess, in a scenario where Donald Trump could, in fact, become the next president of the United States. I'm not asking you for your political opinion on that, but what did you think the effect of Donald Trump was in that region when he was president, and what do you think the potential outcome could be if he was president again?
Well,
it's a hard question.
I mean, not only in the region, but as you know, elsewhere, the Trump administration caused dismay to American allies and a certain amount of satisfaction to its enemies for various reasons. And it is, I didn't get to it because of time limitations, but it is what I would refer to as the joker in the pack. I mean, this is the reason why in this, both the bilateral meeting between the South Koreans and the Americans in May of 2022, and then more recently in the trilateral summit and the trilateral discussions, they tried to institutionalize the process. And part of that was, by which they meant, well, even if at the leaders level, one leader doesn't gain it, there's all these different levels, and there's so many, and basically to institutionalize it. But that certainly is the concern. And I think that certainly for there won't be any negotiations between the North Koreans and the Americans until the result of the American election is known. If it's the case of Trump, Kim Jong-un would welcome very much that result, because he would like to get into a room with Donald Trump without John Bolton, and John Bolton won't be there. He would like to get into that room with him. And so I think for the South Koreans, it's the opposite. They are concerned, as are other American allies in that region and elsewhere, about the potential chaos that this would bring to alliances. But I think that, conversely, not only Kim, but other non-liberal regimes would be happy at the prospect.
Right. Quite fascinated by your analysis of the U.S., South Korea, Japan agreement, not an alliance, as you point out. And yet we hear a lot more, I think, in the daily press, more about this relationship growing between, China, Russia, United Kingdom. What was it that Ronald Reagan talked about? The axis of evil. That's an outmoded term now, I suppose. But is there a sense? I mean, we've had NATO now since the 1940s, but do you think there is a sense within, let's say, South Asia, Asia more broadly, that there needs to be a kind of collective response to the growing threat posed by China, and then potentially linked to that?
But I think that's but that's what you do see. That's what I was referring to when I referred to the security architecture that the Biden administration has been very diligent, sort of under the radar, in creating. I mean, the AUKUS got a lot of publicity at the time when it was created, with Australia and the UK. The Quad has been strengthened, the consultations there. The military arrangements in the Philippines, the trilateral, even outside of this trilateral mechanism, the trilateral military exercises between Japan, South Korea, and the Americans, and the enhanced South Korean American agreements. So I think that they are conscious of the need but as they see it, it would be to respond to the challenge. The challenge is posed on various fronts by China. From the Chinese perspective, it looks like containment.
Right. Yeah, it looks like containment. But would you assess, I mean, with your experience, I mean, that we're as we start to see these kinds of formations of new groupings of states to try and address these different emerging and changing potential challenges, not necessarily threats, that there is kind of a shift away from the organizations and structures that have been sort of dominating the system since the 1940s. Kind of a fun thing a little bit, although it wasn't really fun. There was a statement last week by the Quint about the terrible things that happened in Israel. And Canada was not invited to be part of that and some people had said, well, what's the Quint? And of course, the one of the things was, well, I think it was Eric Morris said, well, if Canada had been invited to be part of that statement, it would have to have been the Sext, and that just wouldn't have gone over well. So we couldn't have been part of that. It had to be the Quint. But these are the sorts of things that are happening that are sort of subliminal, i.e., in relation to the formal structures like NATO, for example, or other international security structures that have been in place. Do you see that there's this response happening?
I see that the Americans have seen a void and a need to build up this, the security architecture, but they're at pains to say this isn't NATO East, this isn't NATO Asia. I mean, there is no treaty. This is a political declaration. But as I say, in the eye of the beholder, again, in Chinese eyes, they at least they say they see a mini NATO, but in the same way that the pact, if you will, North Korea, Russia, and China, may be more looking from the outside than from the inside, because I don't think, China and North Korea, for instance, have a complicated relationship, but it's hardly they're very uneven in their relationships and in their power. And that's why I say that if you look at the Russia, China, and North Korea, they have bilateral relationships with each other, but it's not really a trilateral mechanism. It's more. It seems like sort of an artificial construct.
Yeah. Interesting development you mentioned, and someone has a question about it. With respect to North Korea being able to supply Russia, for example, with weapons, with artillery shells specifically. Does this now? I mean, on the one hand, it obviously signals to some degree Russia's weaknesses with respect to its own military industrial capability production. But on the other hand, there's North Korea sitting out there with this capability to produce presumably significant quantities of munitions. What's your assessment of that? Does North Korea now become the arms dealer to the bad guys? Is that a role for them?
Well,
do they benefit from that?
Yeah. So the experts say about that the North Koreans have these huge stockpiles, which amount to millions of shells, but they also say that there are several. The South Korean expert on the North Korean military and economy said that the North Koreans have several armaments factories that employ thousands of people each, churning out these munitions. So there certainly is a stockpile, and recent reporting has indicated that some of that stockpile, at least, has already headed to Russia, and will continue to go. And as I say, for North Korea, this is a very unusual situation. I mean, North Korea is not usually someplace that at least a country of Russia's stature comes to get assistance.
Exactly.
But so there's concern about both that going to Ukraine or going to Russia for use in Ukraine, but also what may be coming the opposite way. And there you get back to this: how much of a trilateral grouping is this? Because there is assumed to be Chinese concerns about the sort of assistance of a high-tech variety, which could destabilize the Korean Peninsula.
Right. Where do all these developments fit in terms of the United Nations now? Does this just further degrade the role and relevance of the United Nations in trying to contain potential conflict here? North Korea hasn't, I don't think, figured significantly in United Nations deliberations. I could be wrong. You're the expert on this field. But if they start to become more of a player from different perspectives, does this start to complicate the United Nations, for example, discussions around the UN Security Council composition? What's your thinking about that?
Well, the Security Council is in a lock because of China and Russia when it comes to Korean Peninsula activities, and the North Koreans know that, which is why they're confident that there won't be any more Security Council resolutions on North Korea, and there also won't be enforcement, at least robust enforcement, from Russia and China, but it's more important China, because that's where the vast majority of the trade comes from. In terms of actual North Korean role internationally, I think that the global role is more one, at least aspirationally, is one that South Korea aspires to. They say they don't like the term middle power. That is, by they, I mean the UN administration, and they want to be known as the global pivotal player, and they want to be involved in issues and events that are outside, that are not restricted to the Korean Peninsula. But this raises questions in and of itself, because, for instance, to go back to the Taiwan issue, even though there are statements of principle within the trilateral grouping, there would be no, you should not assume that either Japan or South Korea would want to get involved in Taiwan, with certainly South Korea's overwhelming trade is with China, and Japan. China is the largest trading partner.
Right.
But whatever they may want, they'll be drawn in one way or the other, because American troops will come from bases in South Korea and in Japan, which will anger the Chinese in any case. So it's sort of an indirect role. But both the South Koreans and the Japanese would be concerned about, in any case, even outside of a war situation. And it goes back to your question about chips being drawn into a fight with their major trading partner.
Right. One country that we haven't chatted about at all tonight is India. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on where India sits in all of this. I mean, India obviously has, concerns with China. They see them as a competitor on the one hand, but at the same time, their economy is huge. It's growing. They're becoming more influential globally. Presumably, they have some concerns about what's going on with North Korea. And I just wonder, do they figure it all in these conversations?
I think they have concerns about Asia at large, and then beyond that, global issues, but not Korean Peninsula related issues per se. I mean, they've never been engaged like other regional countries in that area. I mean, they do have relations with North Korea, and they have an embassy in Pyongyang.
Okay.
But they're not a major voice in this.
Okay. Okay. All right. Just wondering about that. And I think finally, the last question is about SEATO, SCATO, the Southeast Asian
Treaty Organization.
Treaty Organization. Does it still exist? Does it have any part to play in any of these discussions?
I don't. It certainly isn't a player in Northeast Asia security discussions. I think it may be somewhat moribund.
Okay. Just wondered because it was something that sort of existed for a while and seemed to be an attempt to develop some kind of structures down there. But yeah, just wondered about that. Okay, does anyone have any other burning questions that they need to ask James? Okay. Well, thank you for all the questions that were submitted, and I think James, you handled them magnificently. Thank you so much for your tour de force regarding North Korea's nuclear challenge to international security and order. As you know, and as all of our RCMI members know, this presentation will in fact be posted to our YouTube channel very soon, because I know that Eric Morse will jump on this very soon, and that many more members and the general public will have the opportunity to benefit from your expertise as a result of that. So thank you very much. We reach a pretty wide audience. Let me also thank Thanuja Sradin for her support in making this presentation possible, and of course our Director of Publications, I just mentioned, Eric Morse, for his professional work in getting the word out there. We are not in competition with other organizations, but we fill a particularly unique niche, I think, within the community. But we are very fortunate in being able to attract experts such as James Trottier tonight for our members, but also for the broader public. Our next expert speaker event will be held in person at the RCMI on November 14th. In person at the RCMI on November 14th at 7 p.m. The speaker is someone you probably know well, or at least you think you know well, and that's Scott Taylor, who is the editor of Esprit de Corps magazine, and his presentation is entitled Inside ISIS and the Culture of Terror. He will be discussing his own personal experiences with ISIS, as well as commenting on the ongoing war in Israel and Gaza, and it should be an extremely interesting and no doubt entertaining event indeed. Let me thank everybody else tonight who has signed up for tonight's presentation. I know that your time is valuable. There's lots of choices out there for how you spend it. So your dedication to furthering your knowledge of things defense and security is indeed admirable. James, thanks again. I have no doubt we'll have you back for a fourth, maybe fifth situation, because North Korea doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon.
No, it won't go away. Yes.
Issues in Myanmar are not going away anytime soon. So you are our go-to guy for those regions, and we're always happy to have you because your depth of experience and expertise is profound. So thank you very much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.